In this lecture, we'll continue our study of Proverbs chapter 4, verses 20 to 27, a lecture by the grandfather sage that we're designating poem number 3 with the title, For Life and Health, Train Your Body in Forthright Behaviors. We'll turn our attention now to the structural features, macro and micro, that give shape to this lecture. There are 3 structures that operate at the macro level, that is, spanning more than one section. And incidentally, you do see there in the screen before you that there are 2 sections. The first is a summons that spans verses 20 to 23, a summons to listen, to pay attention, to be receptive to wisdom. The second section spans the remaining verses 23 to 27. And there we see it broken into 3 blocks. The first 2 of those verses, 23 and 4, present some behaviors that a person ought to avoid. So that's negative instruction. And then 25 and 6 seem to cohere as positive instruction, behaviors that a person should engage. And it appears that verse 27 stands apart from these as a conclusion to section 2, and certainly then to the entire poem. Let's look first at macro structures, that is, those that span more than one section. There are 3. The first has to do with a shared theme related to the general semantic field of body parts. The second has to do with the topic of life. And the third is an inclusio, based in the term turn, T-U-R-N. First then, the shared theme of body parts that appears both in sections 1 and 2. We encounter terms such as ear, eyes, mind, and one's entire flesh. These all belong to the general theme of body parts, and they begin right in the summons, that is, section 1. This theme grows even more prominent when we come to section 2, when we encounter terms such as mind, eyes, and feet. And feet will occur twice, both in verses 26 and 27. The second macro structure involves the topic of life. So we see that section 1 promises robust life as an incentive for attending to wisdom's teachings. That shows up in 22a. For they are, that is, those teachings, are life itself to those who find them. The very next verse, which crosses over into section 2, opening section 2, focuses even more closely on life, tracing it to its very source. One who is genuinely interested in the incentive offered in verse 22a, they are life to those that find them. Someone who's interested in that will then want to pay serious attention to the imperative that follows immediately in 23a. It reads, against every imprisonment, protect your mind. And the reason for their interest in that comes back to life, since from there, that mind, life springs forth, according to 23b. So the topic of life spans both section 1 and 2. In each case, it serves as incentive. The third macrostructure involves an inclusio, grounded in the term to turn. We find this in verses 20 and again in 27, first and last. Waltke points this out in his commentary. So with a positive command to turn your ear, the sage opens this entire lesson by summoning the youth to be receptive to wisdom instruction. That's verse 20a. And then, with the negative command, don't turn either right or left, the sage closes the entire teaching concerning right behavior correlated to body parts. That's verse 27, part A. So we see that double mention of the verb turn creates an inclusio, bounding the entire poem. Now let's turn our attention to microstructural features. There are 5. First, imperative plus incentive. Second, summation. Third, negative-positive contrast. Fourth, inclusio. And finally, closure. First, consider the imperative plus incentive structure that we find in section 1, which we're calling a summons. The first block within section 1 coheres as a 2-verse summons, calling the youth to value wisdom teachings. That's verses 20 and 21. We find there no less than 4 imperatives in this quatrain. These are followed by expansive incentives promising nothing less than robust life itself. That appears in verse 22. And so we find section 1 consisting of imperatives, verses 20 and 21, plus incentive, verse 22, all cohesively focusing on the issue of summoning the youth to attentiveness in anticipation of the sage delivering wisdom content in section 2. The second microstructural feature involves summation that closes section 1. As noticed earlier, the following sequence of body parts appears in section 1: the ear, eyes, and mind. Following these 3, the sage adds one more that is more comprehensive in scope, namely one's flesh. By modifying this element of body parts with the word all, the scope escalates to the maximal level through the device of summation. With this sense of climax, the first section comes to an end. Verse 22b. The third microstructure involves negative instructions contrasting positive instructions in blocks 2a and 2b. While blocks 2a and b unite to present the core teaching of this poem, they nevertheless are distinct from each other. The quatrain of block 2a, that is verses 23 and 24, issues negative commands. Against every imprisonment, protect your life. 24, rid yourself of a twisted mouth, and so forth. In contrast, the commands of block 2b, verses 25 and 6, are positive. 25, may your eyes focus directly ahead. 26, pave the track for your feet. The fourth microstructure involves inclusio, consisting of imperative, supported by rationale or incentive. This takes place in blocks 2a and 2b that we just looked at. As it was noticed a moment ago, the core teaching of this entire poem is resident in blocks 2a together with 2b. That span of verses is 23 through 26. Verse 27 stands apart from these as a conclusion. When we focus then on 23 to 26, we notice that the outer verses of that core teaching, that would be verse 23 at the top, 26 at the bottom, those outer verses differ from the inner verses, 24 and 5. And here's what we see. The outer verses support their imperatives either with a rationale or an incentive. So we see in outer verse 23, reading thus, against every imprisonment, protect your mind, and that imperative is followed by a statement of rationale in 23b, namely, for from there life springs forth. Now the following verse, 24, continues with the imperative tone, but there's no incentive. It just lists 2 imperatives back to back. Rid yourself of a twisted mouth and put crooked lips far from you. Verse 25 certainly has more imperatives, but there's no incentive. It's just like 24. But when we come to the lower outer verse of 23 through 26, That is the end of block 2b. Then in verse 26, we find an imperative. In 26a, pave the track for your feet. And then 26b provides an incentive. The basic sense is if you do that, if you pave the track, make your pathway for travel nice and level, then this benefit would follow. All your ways will be made solid. The final microstructure involves closure that takes place in block 2c. That is verse 27, the end of the entire lesson. We find that 4 features within verse 27 are prefigured in prior lines. Here they are. The negative particle al that is rendered don't, do not in verse 27. We've seen this before. It occurred in verse 21 in the expression may they not disappear from your eyes. That also used the negative particle al. Turn, we've already noticed as a macrostructural inclusio. Turn occurred in verse 20b, and we have it here in 27. How about the expression to be rid of something? In verse 27, part B, it reads, rid your feet of wrong. Back in verse 24a, we encountered the expression rid yourself. And finally, the noun feet that we see in 27 also figured in the command of verse 26. As a result, a subtle sense of closure is achieved when these various terms and expressions recur in the poem's last verse. As we draw our study of this poem number 3 to a close, what lessons can we abstract from this careful composition? We find here that with a substantial 3-verse summons, the grandfather signals to his son the start of a new teaching. The first 3 verses, 20, 21, and 22. The grandfather began his initial lecture by underscoring the primacy of wisdom. We're referring here to poem 1, particularly chapter 4, verses 4 through 9. Thereafter, he continued by reprimanding the youth for having taken up travel along the wrong way, despite having received training to the contrary. That was poem number 2, chapter 4, verses 10 through 19. Here in the 3rd poem, the sage outlines what the youth's travel ought to have resembled. By the close of this poem, the youth will move beyond merely realizing that he had made a mistake. Now he will have a concrete idea how to go about actually walking the wisdom path. At the same time, by moving through a succession of 6 body parts with their corresponding behavior, the poet here emphasizes the notion of personal responsibility for particular behavior. Leading the list is the mind. Of utmost importance is protecting the mind against falling captive. Lest any question the mind's susceptibility to capture, one need only consider how substance addiction will hijack a person's entire behavior, rewiring their mind. Customary values are jettisoned in favor of getting the next fix. Nor should the sage's caution against capture be restricted to chemical addictions. Less obvious are imprisonments of the mind that arise from a torn self-image, from disappointments that breed self-pity, or from getting stuck in the past, mired in a maze of debilitating hopelessness. As we consider how thoughtfully the sage has elevated the body part of the mind to a premier place, I trust you are observing that the tendency of some to equate the mind here simply with speech, that is, practice self-control over what you say. This interpretation, it seems to me, does not do justice by any means to the prominence that the sage is placing on one's pattern of thinking, the opinions that one forms, the value systems that one forms, the choices that one makes, which are driven by the mind. This is of great importance to the sage, great importance to the grandfather, and that is why he is locating this lecture very early. Once again, briefly rehearse what ground he has covered. In his first poem, there at the beginning of chapter 4, he's saying, wisdom is important, get wisdom. But at that point, we don't know what is wisdom. Thereafter, he says, young man, you're on the wrong road. Stop the direction you're going. Start going the right direction. But we don't fully know what the right direction is. Now, he says, here is what is the right direction. Here is true wisdom that begins with making sure the way you think, the values that you embrace in your mind, are right and have not been hijacked or taken captive. Consequently, this matter of the mind is of very, very profound importance. Guarding where we allow our minds to dwell is of extreme importance, since the mind alone bears the responsibility for initiating all of life's other behaviors. Verse 23b. Exert no discipline over the mind, and one will lose the entire battle. Perhaps Jesus had this passage in mind when he explained in Matthew 15:19 that contamination comes not from without, but from within, since one's heart is the source of all sorts of harmful behaviors. Instructions for the remaining 5 body parts commend straightness, condemn crookedness, and urge leveling one's way so as to reduce the chance of deviation or distraction. All of these expressions pertain to the journey motif, particularly 24 through 27, which is a metaphor anchored in the preceding lecture. The moral dimension of wise conduct here appears at every turn. The grandfather had discovered that wisdom was not merely a matter of calculated expediency, but rather of thoroughgoing ethical alignment. How quickly he would dismantle as sheer folly any counsel that would promise advancement at the expense of ethics. These 4 verses, 24, 5, 6, and 7, so full of warning to avoid the devious while embracing the upright, they indicate that the writer reckons seriously with the pull and peril of seductive sirens, against which the youth must discipline himself to stop his ears. It is to that fatal attraction that the grandfather will turn in his next lecture.